Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk about migration in Latin America or from Latin America and to Latin America. And there are kind of two common models of why people migrate. Your book mentions Ravenstein's laws, more or less, Ravenstein's laws, but I favor Lee's model. Each are good to know about. So the basic idea of both these models is pretty much the same. People migrate when factors at home and factors where they have the opportunity to migrate to lead them to decide to migrate. Ravenstein's laws hold up today for the most part, despite the fact that he developed them in the 1880s using data from the 1871 census and the 1881 census of Great Britain. Think about that. That's one data point, and that this whole set of migration laws or rules are based on. But the basic laws, Ravenstein's basic laws, are pretty straightforward, and they hold up pretty well, actually, within Latin America and the Caribbean. They kind of come down to this. Migrations tend to be over short distances, and they don't tend to be long, epic migrations over thousands of miles. I know this is a mind blower, but according to an article from The Economist in the late 2000s, only about 5% of the world's world's population migrates internationally. Migration tends to be from rural areas to commercial centers, which are typically urban. Well, this is a no-brainer. We see this in Indiana, right? This is definitely a trend in Latin America too, where over the past 80 years or so, 80% of Latin America's population has become urban-based. And most migration has compensating currents, which is an alliterative way of saying when people move from one place to another, they're generally replaced with migrations from another place to the one they came to. This is probably one of Ravenstein's weakest laws, but we still find it holding up from time to time. Another point that Ravenstein's laws touched on is the fact that migration currents have very similar characteristics. Migrants tend to be of a similar background, age, financial status, etc. And longer migrations tend to be to urban areas, but things like state-led land reform can screw that one up. And that's why this law falls flat on its face in Cuba and the Amazon, where state-led agrarian reform has been a big deal, basically moving people from cities to rural areas. Urban residents are less likely to migrate, and they tend to stay urban when they do. And then finally, Ravenstein said that longer migrations are generally made up of males, while shorter ones tend to be female-led. If we think about migrant labor in the U.S., many of the migrants are male workers. Some bring their families, but not as many, right? The other model, which is Lee's pull and push model, is a lot different, but it does describe many of the same processes. Lee's model describes these migrations as happening, as happening due to push and pull factors. Well, what's a push factor? Well, a push factor is a negative, like famine, war, poor prospects for jobs. And pull factors tend to be positive things like good jobs, better food security, health care, no war, stuff like that. And these pull and push factors exist both at the origin, so the place where the person's from, and where they eventually end up, the destination. But where the migrant ends up is based significantly upon what are known as intervening obstacles, which tend to be things along the way that redirect where the migrant's going. Some examples might include misinformation about a place, lack of money to get there, but also things like illiteracy, which might limit opportunities, or language barriers, maybe even family pressures, which could cut a migration short and make it end up a migration to a closer place. In talking about migration, we have to be clear about something, and this is something you have to think about. Migration and immigration are very different. They're two different things. Migration might not be a voluntary move. Acute environmental catastrophe, which is what this week's discussion board is about, might lead people to migrate. This happens when severe drought strikes, or maybe even a seasonal environmental change like dry seasons or flooding might lead people to migrate in order to deal with that change. In Latin American floodplain areas, people begin to use upland areas more intensively during high water seasons, which entails a short migration. But then when the water recedes, they migrate the short distance back to the floodplain. Another confusion people have is that migration entails a permanent move. It doesn't. This is not the case, actually. Migration being permanent isn't the case most of the time, including the one I just mentioned. People have cycles of migration where sometimes they'll live in the city, but they also move out to urban areas. Seasonal migration is the case where the majority is the case for the majority of guest workers in this country. They migrate depending on what crops need to be harvested at what times of the year and where they are planted, and then return to their home territories. Immigration, okay, so migration is often impermanent and can take place within a nation's borders. So you could migrate from, Indianapolis to Boston or New York and then come back. It's basically moving from one place to another to live for a time. Immigration, on the other hand, is a permanent move to another country. It's permanent, it's international, right? You can't immigrate from Los Angeles to Boston, but you can immigrate from Ecuador to Boston, right? Or Ecuador to Queens. And we're going to talk about Ecuador to Queens in a minute here because it's an interesting story. There are a lot of reasons to reasons for migration. But these are the three big ones. Economic push or pull. So this could be factors that push people away, like land access or employment opportunities not being available. And then, maybe the pull factors are there is land or there are jobs. Political stability can be a push or a pull factor. So instability is a push factor. Stability could be a pull factor. And then environment. We've already talked about a couple of these. Incidentally, in Latin America, political stability or change in political regime has been a big push factor for migration. In fact, we can look at this, migration being circular from place A to place B to place A again, or chain migration. You move to a place on your own, bring family members as you can afford to. But there are other types. Okay, circular migration is a strategy of around a quarter of all agricultural migrant labor in the U.S. Half the year they work in the U.S., the other half in Mexico or another Central American country. Migration can take place not just in national borders. So check out this map from 1973. It shows internal migration in Guatemala. And if you notice, everyone's moving to Guatemala City. Well, if you put this into context, in 1973, it was the beginning of a very large and ongoing, very large and long civil war. People moved to the capital to avoid that conflict. So there was a push factor conflict pulling them to the capital where there was not likely to be as much risk of conflict. That's not to discount the migration across national borders, though. A lot of migration happens in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, a lot of out-migration that happens is to the Europe and the U.S. On English-speaking islands, many head to Europe, while Cubans and Haitians are frequently granted refugee status to migrate to the U.S. Central America is really complex. There are a lot of people who move country to country, often heading north, but not always. Conflict and repression have been a big push factor in that region for the last 30 years, 35 years. And there have been a number of trans-border identities, like the Maya. They're not linked to any one country, but they kind of move around a lot. Central American migrants often make it to Mexico, then eventually move to the U.S., but not always. In South America, there are a lot of migrants. Bolivians in the highlands often move to Argentina, which has a stronger economy and better jobs. Lowland Bolivians make their way towards the Amazon. In Peru, people move from the Andes, where agriculture is tough, to the Amazon, where agriculture is easy and land is easier to get. Peru, people move from the Andes to the coastal ports, where jobs are better. In Venezuela, people move from agriculture to oil-producing regions. And then Mexico, we see, we're familiar with this, we see migration within Mexico to Mexico City, but then also to the U.S. But it turns out most migration in Mexico is actually internal and towards urban areas or oil-producing areas. Arrows don't. In this map, we do show that there's quite a bit of migration to the United States, and in most of these cases, the arrows aren't really pointing to the right place necessarily. Like, it's not like Dominicans go to Georgia. They go everywhere in the U.S., but all told, we see about 500,000 people from the Americas coming to the United States every year. Yes, the majority come from Mexico, but a lot come from El Salvador, from Cuba, from Haiti, even from other South American countries, Brazil, Nicaragua, all over the place. It's not just Mexico, although they definitely are a big factor. Migration, though, has a long history, and it's actually not been a source of migrants and immigrants for all that long. Before World War II, most Latin American countries were actually attracting huge numbers of people. During the colonial era, of course, there were a lot of slave immigrants, but after abolition, a lot of Germans, Italians, and others made their way to Latin America, just like they made their way here to the United States. And especially Brazil and Argentina played host to these folks. Excuse me. And it was just like the forces that drive immigration now. At the time, before World War II, Europeans and others came to Latin America and the Caribbean because of the prospect of jobs and more land availability. The impact on the cultural landscape in Latin America was very notable. Italian restaurants are all over the place in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. This picture is from Florianopolis, Brazil. There's great sushi in parts of Brazil and Peru and elsewhere. There's lots of Japanese immigrants for a period of time in this period. And then parts of Brazil and Argentina, people speak German and eat German food. I went to the southern part of Brazil before I spoke Portuguese, and people were trying to talk German to me all the time. People just have a pride in that heritage, just like many communities here in Indiana do. However, in the post-war era, the region became a place of emigration. People were looking to leave because of push and pull factors flipped around. In Europe and North America, job prospects were better. And after World War II, many Japanese immigrants returned home as well. Most Germans and Italians, though, they stuck around. And it might not, if you think about it for a minute, it might not be a mystery why they did. Probably don't want to head back to Italy or Germany while you're trying to rebuild those countries after the war, right? In terms of world migration trends, we have to put these in context. We've got to remember that it's not like we see migration from Latin America to the United States that exceeds any kind of previous eras, right? We see lots of migration of Europeans to the New World. Of course, that happened early on in this time period. We also see a large influx of African slaves to the New World, forced migration in this case. But we see a pretty heavy stream of folks moving all around the world. One thing that's kind of interesting about this is the map here really emphasizes European migration quite a bit, but it's not a distortion. Since 1500, Europeans have migrated an incredible amount. So just think about it. Nearly everyone in this country was a migrant, unless you're 100% Native American. And even then, probably sometime between 5,000 and 30,000 years ago, your ancestors migrated here. You're European or African, right? And that fact doesn't stop folks from getting wound up about migration, right? We have a history of it. It's part of our history. And, keep in mind that if we had this map made since 1000 BC, the trends would be really different. So keep that in mind. Right? Migration isn't just Mexicans taking our jobs, which sometimes people get hysterical about. Just to emphasize, during the immigration heyday in Latin America, there were a lot of different sources for immigrants. We know a good deal about African and European immigration. We had Africa. It was involuntary immigration during the colonial period from lots of different regions, but particularly West Africa. In Europe, we had kind of two periods. We had the colonial period and then the 19th and 20th centuries. This immigration was voluntary, but not always on the best terms, and was based on push factors. Asian immigration to Latin America consisted of Japanese folks who were pushed there by factors in Japan, but did so voluntarily. And then the Chinese, Javanese, and South Asians were involuntarily relocated in the early 1900s as railroad laborers, right? What about these Levantines? What are they? Well, they're Christians from Lebanon and Syria. They were settled in Brazil, Ecuador, and Bolivia between 1890 and 1940. And they came mainly, about 120,000 of them came mainly focusing on new opportunities for commerce. So that was an economic pull factor for them. In the post-World War II period, the migration is defined by people leaving Latin America. And the switch was pretty dramatic. So economies were more shifted because of the Monroe Doctrine to be more American-centric, and they also became more nationalistic, and that led to some pretty strange economic situations where protected industries didn't grow as rapidly as they might have otherwise. Jobs declined, they didn't pay as well, economies neglected the poor, and so there was this pull factor to north of the border, right, to the North American economies of the U.S. and Canada, and those pull factors pulled people to new opportunities in North America. However, the stereotype of Latin American migrant labor is different than many North Americans think it is. It takes money to migrate, so though migrants tend to be of meager financial means when they arrive, they aren't the poorest of the poor for the most part. And about 500,000 people come legally to the U.S. every year, and the number of illegal immigrants is about equal to that. So for every immigrant to the United States that you see from Latin America, there's about a 50-50 chance that they're legal or illegal, right? This migration, though, is problematic for Latin America because typically the more skilled or diligent laborers come north because they haven't been able to amass the wealth necessary to apply for visas or work permits or have the money to pay to be smuggled across the border. The U.S. is pretty interested in Latin American technicians and academics, so Latin America is subjected to what some people call brain drain. So we kind of have two simultaneous flows out of Latin America. One is approved of, we get their technicians and academics. The other is less approved of, we get their laborers, right? Also, 15 million people born in Latin America now live in the U.S. permanently. And 20% of foreigners live in Spain are from Latin America. So, 1 in 4 Salvadorians live in the U.S., not in El Salvador. 20% of foreigners in Spain are from Latin America. So it's not just the U.S. that is having this massive migration of people coming in. Let's look at some Ecuadorian migration. Well, why care about Ecuador? Well, that's a good question. We're all familiar with Mexican migrants and other Latino migrants like Puerto Ricans, Salvadorians, but there's another source country that falls off most North Americans' radars, and that's Ecuador. Ecuador is a pretty cool place, by the way, but living there isn't very easy. In the Andes, everything is at altitude, agriculture is hard or impossible due to temperature, rain, slope problems that lead to landslides, all kind of stuff. Along the Pacific coast, weather is really dry, so agriculture is difficult and expensive because it requires irrigation, and land costs quite a bit. In the Amazon part of Ecuador, there's lots of land, but there's also lots of disease, uncertain legal arrangements for land title, and other hardships, and so it's not super attractive. And then all of this amounts to being a big push factor. Things aren't really easy, there's a lack of opportunities for employment or to own your own land. So there's a push. Combine that with a pull. There's relatively better paying seasonal jobs elsewhere, like in the U.S. And so since 1960 in Ecuador, we've actually seen a pretty big increase in folks coming to the United States from Ecuador. So in 2005, the number of Ecuadorians with permanent residency status in the U.S. was about 91,000, right? But what happened since 1989? Check it out. It was, pretty much stabilized, and then it took off big time. Why do you think that happened? Well, it's because it relates to a series of phases in terms of Ecuador's migration into the United States. So yeah, more phases, but because the character of migration in Ecuador has changed, we have 3 distinct phases of migration to the U.S. The first phase was some circular migration. It was based on seasonal work on lowland banana plantations and increasingly to work wage jobs during agricultural down periods that happen at home. So This is the time that Ecuador was doing well with export crops like bananas. Circular migration is mostly men who returned to 10 subsistence plots in the highland, and then the push to migrate came from an inability to maintain households on subsistence agriculture in highland areas. However, so there's a banana boom, but there was also a cash income boom in Panama hats, which, despite the name, were actually made in Ecuador, not Panama. And as they fell out of style in the 1950s to 60s, that economic opportunity collapsed. So between bananas crashing in the 70s and cash income through Panama hats collapsing in the 60s, what's the solution? Migration. So you start to migrate internationally to make up for the lost opportunities, and that's the second phase: international migration from the U.S. or from Ecuador to the U.S. And the pull factor was better jobs or the potential for a more comfortable life in the U.S. And it was chain migration. It's a classic example of chain migration. Ecuadorians practically invented this tactic. So first, a member of the family, generally a young male, would immigrate to the U.S. And as a person socked away a little bit of money, they'd pay to have their relatives move to the U.S., one by one by one. And often people who came later on the chain would be legal, whereas the person bringing them to the U.S. was not. And this happens way more often than you would think. I met a fellow in rural South Carolina who was illegal, but his children and wife had all immigrated legally. All right, pretty interesting. One of the primary spots for immigration to the U.S. For Ecuadorians was Queens, so much so that Queens has the third largest settlement of Ecuadorians in the world. Crazy, right? The other part of the story is that remittances are a big part of the story. Over $2 billion per year moves from the Queens, the borough of New York, known as Queens, to Ecuador. That's a lot of money. How does that work? Well, it turns out since 2001, the official currency of Ecuador has been the U.S. dollar, more or less. So it's been pegged to the U.S. dollar after they had a kind of currency collapse. And so this generates more wealth than anything else in the country of Ecuador except for its oil exports. Crazy. Reparations, or remittances rather, from the U.S. to Ecuador make up most of its money. Well, how do Ecuadorians get to Queens? Well, they can actually really easily fly to Mexico, at which point they could get to the border region on a bus and then walk to the U.S. Another option is to hire a coyote or pasador. This is a risky option, and it's pretty dangerous. But to give you an idea of the cost of paying someone to help you get from the U.S. to Mexico, in 1970 it was pretty cheap. $1,200 gets you across, not too much regulation at the border. By 1995, border control had increased, and costs had gone up for these coyotes or pasadors, and cost was about $5,000. Today, it's between $15,000 and $30,000. Expensive. And today, if you're caught, typically you have a total of 3 chances for the price. So you get caught, you get deported, you get another chance. Get caught, get deported, you've got one more chance, and if you use up your chances, you're out of money. It's dangerous, not just because border vigilantes might shoot you or you might get apprehended and deported, but because these coyotes and pasadores are pretty unscrupulous and they're happy to screw you over to make a few bucks. I already mentioned this, but migrants have been mostly men initially, and they come from the Andean zones of Ecuador because the Amazon's hard to get to or from and has some pretty decent employment options like oil. And then later, once they were successful, they'd build the chain, right, often through legal channels. And this has led to the phase 3 of migration from Ecuador, and it's become much harder recently. It's expensive and dangerous, and we're currently building an immense border wall. We've actually mostly finished it, but we continue to militarize the border with Mexico. And border control and immigration control actually increased quite a bit since post-September 11th, since the terrorist attacks in September 11th, 2001, and that means that immigration to the U.S. has become tough. So the solution's been, let's go to Europe, and particularly people go to Spain. It's easier because Ecuadorians can get a 90-day tourist visa, and the economy used to be doing pretty well. At least better than Ecuador, so there were a lot of jobs, and especially for service. Remember, Ecuador's economy collapsed in 2000, and despite Spain's problems, Ecuador is still not doing as well as Spain economically, so there's opportunities in Spain that aren't in Mexico. And cultural barriers don't really exist. Language isn't much of an option. There's similar cultural background. And since the mid-1990s, about 125,000 Ecuadorians have moved to Spain, right? You can see the impact it's had on the population of foreigners in Spain. 40% of foreigners in Spain come from Latin America, or come from the Americas, and most of them are from Latin America, and a lot of those are Ecuadorian. So, immigration, it's not just, Mexicans moving to the U.S., it's much more complicated than that.